huge turnouts from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, West Virginia, Utah, and beyond. Protests in nearly every state.
What you are about to hear in this video segment is a documented observation. In the early month of April, 2025, people across the United States took to the streets to demand that the Trump administration keep its hands off democracy. It should keep its hands off Black history too. This is because since Trump took office, the Park Service, an agency charged with preserving American history, has changed how its website describes key moments, from slavery to Jim Crow. In April 2025, it was reported that the United States National Park Service had begun scrubbing information from its exhibits about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, one of the most significant stories of resistance against chattel slavery in the United States. The page had been edited to remove material about the anti-slavery leader. Other government pages have been changed or deleted amid efforts to scrub references to diversity and inclusion. For years, the National Park Service webpage introduced the Underground Railroad with a large photograph of its most famous conductor, Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad, the resistance to enslavement through escape and flight, through the end of the Civil War, refers to the efforts of enslaved African Americans to gain their freedom by escaping bondage. The page began, but Tubman's photograph is now gone. In its place are images of Postal Service stamps that highlight Black-white cooperation in the secret network, and that feature Tubman among abolitionists of both races. The introductory sentence is gone too. It has been replaced by a line that makes no mention of slavery and that describes the Underground Railroad as one of the most significant expressions of the American civil rights movement. The effort bridged the divides of race, the page now says, from painting over Washington, D.C. as Black Lives Matter mural, to temporarily scrubbing the stories of Navajo code talkers in World War II. From federal websites, scholars and activists say the Trump administration is trying to erase non-white history. Stories of even recent non-white history are being erased at rapid speed. Kayana Jones says it hurt seeing the jackhammers dig up the yellow concrete that she had painted with the words Black Lives Matter.
When you're down there literally hearing and feeling the street being torn up, seeing like literally the paint being pushed to the side.
That was Kayana Jones. 5 years ago, after the police killing of George Floyd, Jones was one of the artists who came out to paint in the middle of the night. She says watching the mural's removal felt like watching an attempt to erase the racial justice movement that arose out of grief over Floyd's killing. Jones says there's always been this kind of erasure, but now it's supercharged. The Department of Defense, for example, has been scrubbing websites for images and articles they equate with diversity, equity, and inclusion. A page about the military career of baseball great Jackie Robinson was erased and then restored after pushback, as a few others have been. Don Moynihan, a political scientist at the University of Michigan, says that many pages and pictures, like on Arlington National Cemetery's website, are just gone. He says the Pentagon tells the larger story of defending America through individual tales of heroism.
If you take away pictures of women, if you take away pictures of Black heroes, of Asians, of Native Americans, of Latinos, then who's left?
Don Moynihan asks, out of despair.
It sends a message that only white men belong.
Moynihan points to the erasing of articles about the Navajo code talkers, who used their native language to create an unbreakable code in World War II. The DoD has restored those pages, but Zonnie Gorman, whose father was a code talker, says even the temporary erasure feels scary. Gorman says Native Americans have a long history of being erased. When her father and the other code talkers were kids, they were sent to federal boarding schools,
where they were systematically attempting to destroy our language and our culture. And the irony, right, that same government would turn around during World War II and say, hey, gee, well, can you use your language and help us win this war?
She says the code talker's story is proof that diversity makes us stronger. But that contradicts the message coming from Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, a former Fox News host. Here he is in February, talking to Pentagon staff.
I think the single dumbest phrase in military history is our diversity is our strength. I think our strength is our unity.
Jason Stanley, a professor of philosophy at Yale, whose most recent book is titled Erasing History, says it isn't unifying to ban these histories. He says recent history is also being erased. He too points to the Black Lives Matter mural. It's not just about getting rid of a painting, he says, but an attempt to paint over evidence of a movement that brought people across the world out onto the streets.
We supposedly all coalesced as a country around finally trying to address structural racism, and there are symbols representing this kind of agreement.
The executive order that President Trump issued on the March of 2025 directing the Smithsonian Institution to eliminate divisive narratives stirred fears that the government had aimed to whitewash the stories the nation tells about itself. But a Washington review of websites operated by the National Park Service, among the key agencies charged with the preservation of American history, found that edits on dozens of pages since Trump's inauguration have already softened descriptions of some of the most shameful moments of the nation's past. Some were edited to remove references to slavery. On other pages, statements on the historic struggles of Black Americans for their rights were cut or softened, as were references to present-day echoes of racial division. The Post compared web pages as of late March to earlier versions preserved online by the Internet's Archive's Wayback Machine. Changes in images, descriptions, and even individual words have subtly reshaped the meaning of notable moments and key figures dating to the nation's founding. An educational page on Benjamin Franklin, which examined his views on slavery and his ownership of enslaved people, was taken offline in the month of March 2025, the review found. Mentions of Thomas Stone, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, owning enslaved people, were removed from several pages on the website of the Stone National Historic Site in southern Maryland. A reference to other enslaved African Americans in that region was changed to enslaved workers. Trump has pursued broad executive orders and other means aimed at dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the public and private sectors. His Inauguration Day order targeting DEI programs in government did not explicitly call for websites to be edited, but it has been interpreted aggressively by some officials, most notably at the Defense Departments, which purged many pages that celebrated minority veterans. After an outcry, some were later restored. At the Interior Department, which oversees the Park Service, political appointees directed senior career officials to identify web pages that might need to be changed, according to 2 Park Service employees who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they feared retribution. The senior career officials had asked staff members to compile lists of potentially problematic pages, the employees said. Those lists were sent up the management chain for consideration. The employees did not know whether those changes identified by the Post were made as a result of this process, but one said that some staff members were expensive in selecting pages for edits. The employees said staff members received only vague guidance and that the selections were made amid a frenzy of fear, at a time when thousands of workers were losing their jobs. You draw as broad a brush as possible, because the consequences of missing something are a lot more severe than the consequences of doing too much, the employee said. A third NPS employee, also speaking from the condition of anonymity, made mention that some web page changes resulted not from demands above, but from lower-level employees seeking to comply with what they believed Donald Trump wanted. An Interior spokesperson did not respond to a request for comments on the employee's account. Asked about the website changes, a Park Service spokesperson offered a statement but didn't address specific edits.
The National Park Service has been entrusted with preserving local history, celebrating local heritage, safeguarding special places, and sharing stories of American experiences. We take this role seriously and can point to many examples of how we tell nuanced and difficult stories about American history,
the statement said. The Post examined changes on thousands of Park Service web pages. The vast majority were routine. A handful added mentions of slavery or enslaved people. The Post could not identify every change made since Trump took office, in part because the Wayback Machine's archives are not comprehensive. On the website of Minuteman National Historic Park in Lincoln, Massachusetts, a passage about the lack of recognition for Black soldiers who fought for American independence was removed. Why don't we hear more about this part of the American Revolution? The passage began. according to archived versions of the site. Unfortunately, systemic racism and historical bias have erased or buried many records of Black and Indigenous people who played a prominent role in the founding of the United States. A statement about the legacy of John Brown, who hopes to start a revolt by enslaved people in the run-up to the Civil War, was removed from a page on the website of Harper's Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia. John Brown's complex legacy remains a powerful symbol in America's ongoing dialogue on race, justice, and the fight against oppression, the line said. Extensive changes were made to multiple Park Service pages about the Underground Railroad, and a landing page directing children to the educational materials about it has been offline since the month of March 2025. Since 1998, the Park Service has been required by federal law to recognize the Underground Railroad and to produce educational materials about it. Andrew Deemer, a professor at Towson University and author of a book on one of the network's founders, made mention that while some white abolitionists supported the Underground Railroad, changes identified by the Post minimized the legal and political forces arrayed at the time against enslaved African Americans. Overall, the revisions seek to emphasize harmony and unity, and to de-emphasize conflict in a way that is out of step with how historians have written about the Underground Railroad in recent decades, Deemer said. Other changes appear on the website of Appomattox Courthouse National Historic Park in Virginia, where Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union forces in April 1865, leading to the Civil War's end. One page, about the surrounding town, was rewritten in a way that incorporated 2 new mentions of slavery in the years before the war. But on other pages about the battle and subsequent emancipation of local enslaved people, all references to President Abraham Lincoln's views of the war were removed, as were some references to Union Army Commander General Ulysses S. Grant views. Some mentions of slavery were cut, along with details of how white hostility in the area thwarted the efforts of freed Black people to enter their society. Greg Downs of the University of California at Davis, a specialist in Civil War history, who has written several Park Service publications, said the changes warped history.
A country that cannot tell the truth about itself cannot assess what has led it to moments of greatness in the past and what could lead it again to greatness,
he said. Altercations were also made to Park Service content about major figures and events in the civil rights movement during the 20th century. A page about the Niagara Movement, a group founded in 1905 by the African-American civil rights leader W.E.B. Du Bois, was changed to remove 2 references to the struggle for equality. For example, a description of the group's renewed sense of resolve in the struggle for freedom and equality became simply its renewed sense of resolve. Sean Lee Alexander, a Du Bois biographer and professor at the University of Kansas, described the alterations as subtle yet profound, in suggesting that racism no longer requires confrontation in the United States at the time.
Although these changes may appear inconsequential to some, they collectively contribute to the erasure of the historical narrative of the Black struggle for civil, political, and economic rights, which continues to this day,
he said. Similar amendments were made to the website of the Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site in Arkansas, which marked the place where 9 young African-American students braved a racist mob and military resistance from state authorities to integrate a previously white-only school in 1957. Proclamations that the students opened doors for others pursuing equality and education around the world were edited on at least 6 pages to remove the word equality. One of the surviving members of the Little Rock Nine, Elizabeth Eckford, told the Post that the edits masked the fact that the group had explicitly fought for equality of opportunity. They are trying to rewrite history, Eckford said. We can never have true racial reconciliation until we honestly acknowledge our shameful but shared past. The move would have destroyed knowledge about how oppressed people in the United States have successfully fought for freedom. While the Park Service walked back the revisions after public outcry, it's just one example of the Trump administration's campaign to curtail understanding of racism's legacy in the United States. The erasure at the Park Service follows President Donald J. Trump's recent executive order targeting the National Museum of African American History and Culture for being divisive, which led to museum director Kevin Young's resignation last Friday. Leaders called the order a sign of the administration's attempts to stifle cultural spaces dedicated to preserving Black history and truths that don't align with Trump's political ideology. The Institute for Museum and Library Studies has also been subjected to staff and funding cuts. These actions continue similar efforts during Trump's first term, including his ban on efforts to inculcate what he called divisive concepts. He was targeting work like the 1619 Project, a publication exploring the enduring impacts of racial slavery in the United States, including in housing, incarceration, healthcare, and education. Trump also created the 1776 Commission, which aimed to produce patriotic education that whitewashed history and understated the role racism played in shaping U.S. political, economic, and legal systems. International human rights bodies have condemned these kinds of practices. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination maintains that states should educate the population as a whole in a spirit of non-discrimination, specifically regarding people of African descent. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protects minorities' rights to enjoy their culture, including in community with others. To exercise that right, people need access to accurate historical knowledge about their communities. Assaults on historical truth serve a purpose. They prevent Americans from understanding that racism is less about individual blame, but is instead a system built and maintained through centuries of law, policy, and violence. The attacks also deny people access to models of courage and organized resistance like Tubman and the Underground Railroad. This isn't only about the past. It's about politicians trying to foreclose the possibility of confronting ongoing and future injustices. People across the United States had taken to the streets in this regard to demand that the Trump administration keep its hands-off democracy. It should keep its hands-off Black history too. As though the situation isn't uncanny enough, the unfolding goes even deeper to reveal the Trump administration is actually here to finish an agenda almost as old as the United States itself, an unfinished agenda, which has been here since 1866. Everything we're taught in school, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, has been rewritten in front of our very eyes. Now let us go back in time to see what this is about and how long this has been. When the Confederacy lost the Civil War in 1865, they lost everything. Southern wealth plummeted by 60%, and nearly 300,000 of their sons, fathers, and brothers were 6 feet underground. Their entire economic system built on the backs of enslaved people was destroyed. Their cities were burned, their economy shattered, their entire way of life gone. But while most of the South was trying to rebuild, one man was busy rewriting. His name was Edward Pard, editor of the Richmond Examiner, and he was about to write the book that would change American history forever, The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates. This book essentially became the propaganda's blueprint. You see, Pard understood something crucial. They say history is written by the winners. But Pard knew that if you control how history is written, you control the narrative. And in those pages, he laid out exactly how to do it. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. First, rewrite the cause of the war. While Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens had proudly declared in 1861 that their new government was founded on the great truth that is not equal to the white man, Pard and his supporters pushed a different story. According to them, the South fought for states' rights. They were noble defenders of their homeland against Northern aggression and enslavement. Well, apparently that was actually good. But Pard didn't stop there. He and his fellow Lost Cause writers turned Confederate generals into saints, and none more so than Robert E. Lee, the most successful military commander of the Confederate Army. Lee became more than just a general. They transformed him into a Christ-like figure, the ultimate Christian soldier who they claimed only reluctantly took up arms to defend his state of Virginia. After his death in 1870, they elevated him to almost godlike status, even calling him the Second Washington. Never mind that he led an army against the very nation Washington helped create. Confederate soldiers weren't fighting for enslavement. They were heroic warriors defending their homes against invaders. And the South's defeat That wasn't because their cause was wrong. No, it was simply because the North had more men, more guns, more resources. They were just overwhelmed. It sounds absurd, right? That the losing side of a war could just rewrite history. But here's the thing. Pard's book became the very foundation for a systemic campaign to reshape American memory. A campaign so effective that its lies are still repeated today. Because just 1 year after Pard published his book, something started happening across the South that was truly shocking. While Confederate men were busy writing their version of history, Southern women were about to turn that story into reality. It started innocently enough. In the aftermath of war, women across the South formed memorial associations to collect the bodies of Confederate soldiers and give them proper burials. But these weren't just grieving mothers and widows. They were seeds of something much more powerful. In 1869, Confederate veterans including Braxton Bragg and Jubal Early formed the Southern Historical Society, and their mission was to defend every aspect of the Confederate cause through published papers and speeches. But it was what happened next that would change American history forever. In 1894, a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy was born. These women had the most insidious plan to control what children were learning at the time. That's right. We all know education has perhaps the biggest impact on kids when they're young. And if you teach your next generation that the Confederacy were fighting a noble cause, what do you have? You have another generation of bigoted, hateful, and ignorant people. Exactly the sort of people who would perpetuate an obvious lie. Within just a few years, the UDC had grown to 100,000 members strong. They had chapters beyond the South and across the entire country, and they wielded their power with surgical precision. At the heart of this operation was Mildred Rutherford, an educator and author who created something called a measuring rod for textbooks, a manual that would determine what version of history American children would learn. The system was brutally effective. Any book that didn't match their version of history was marked with unjust to the South and removed from the library shelves. Any textbook that mentioned the horrors of enslavement or the true causes of the Civil War were banned from classrooms. But they didn't stop there. They created the Children of the Confederacy, where young Southerners were required to memorize the Confederate Catechism, a call and response system that drilled their twisted version of history into children's minds. Kids as young as 6 were taught to recite truths about the Confederacy, competing for rewards as they absorbed these lies. They staged elaborate ceremonies where school children were arranged into living glass at monument unveilings. And those Confederate monuments you see in town squares across America, the ones causing so much controversy today. Yeah, the UDC put those there. They didn't just build statues. They placed them strategically in front of courthouses, in town squares, anywhere they could cement their version of history in stone. But reshaping Confederate memory was just the beginning. These women had an even darker, more disturbing goal. You see, after the Civil War ended in 1865, America entered a period called Reconstruction. And for the first time, the federal government tried to make good on the promise of freedom, passing the first civil rights acts in American history and constitutional amendments that guaranteed black citizenship and voting rights. Black Americans seized this opportunity. They were voting, getting elected to Congress, building schools and businesses, and creating their own newspapers. They were living proof that the lost cause narrative was a lie. So the architects of the lost cause did something ingenious. They made sure black voices would never reach the history books. Remember those textbook guidelines created by Mildred Rutherford and the UDC? They didn't just promote Confederate heroes. They systematically removed any mention of black achievement. The Freedmen's Bureau, black congressmen, the Civil Rights Acts, all erased. But they went even further. As Reconstruction was giving black Americans unprecedented freedom, a group of white Southerners emerged with a mission to take it all away. They called themselves the Redeemer Democrats. Democrats who wanted to redeem the South by returning it to white. These redeemers couldn't be as obvious as they were during Confederate days. No more riding around in masks intimidating black voters. Instead, they had to be subtle. So, they created a two-pronged attack on the ground. Radical groups like the Red Shirts and White League used violence to drive black voters away from the polls. Suddenly, owning people as property wasn't a brutal system anymore. It was reimagined as a teaching experience where enslaved people became more civilized. Some lost cause writers even claimed that enslaved people had better lives than British working-class people. And here's the worst part. By the time Jim Crow laws were firmly in place, there was no one left in power to challenge those lies. When that wasn't enough, they created new stereotypes straight from lost cause propaganda, meant to portray black Americans as unprepared for freedom. These were weapons designed to justify segregation and the complete reversal of everything black Americans had achieved during Reconstruction. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn. You see, the South was about to pull off something unprecedented. They were going to make the North embrace their lies. From the White House to Hollywood, from college classrooms to children's movies, the lost cause was about to become America's official story. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. You'd think America would reject the propaganda of traitors who nearly destroyed the Union. But not only did the North welcome the lost cause with open arms, they taught it in their schools, screened it in their theaters, and ultimately helped turn Confederate mythology into American history. So, how does the winning side of a war end up adopting the sore loser's version of history? The answer starts with a funeral. In 1885, Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who had defeated the Confederacy, was laid to rest. Among his pallbearers were former Confederate generals Joseph E. Johnston and Simon Bolivar Buckner. The man who crushed the rebellion was being carried to his grave by the very men who fought to preserve enslavement. While it was a funeral on the surface, it was actually America announcing that white reconciliation mattered more than historical truth. By the 1890s, Northern public opinion had shifted dramatically. Americans had grown disillusioned with Reconstruction and were eager to move on from the divisiveness of the Civil War. In 1898, President William McKinley made this reconciliation official. When America declared war on Spain, he deliberately appointed former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler to lead the cavalry division. As one historian put it, President McKinley purposely chose ex-Confederate General Joe Wheeler as head of the cavalry division, thereby symbolically reunifying the nation through an ex-Confederate. But this reconciliation came with a terrible cost. To welcome the South back into the national fold, the North had to accept the South's version of history. And that meant embracing the lost cause, a lie that the war was fought over states' rights, not what it was really about, and keeping black people in an inferior socioeconomic class. But here's what you might not realize. This wasn't just about healing wounds. There was something much more insidious happening behind the scenes. Because for propaganda to become history, you need the stamp of academic approval. And that's exactly what the lost cause got. The American history profession was still in its infancy. The first history PhD in America was only awarded in 1882, and the American Historical Association formed in 1884. These early historians saw themselves as nation builders, writing history backwards as if the United States had always been destined to exist, and the lost cause got wrapped up in all of that. At Columbia University, Professor William Archibald Dunning created what became known as the Dunning School of Reconstruction History. These historians portrayed Reconstruction as a terrible mistake, where vengeful Republicans punished the South and incompetent black politicians corrupted state governments. The Dunning School became a powerful tool for white. Dunning himself was a redeemer whose work gave intellectual legitimacy to Jim Crow laws and the disenfranchisement of black voters. Meanwhile, Frederick Jackson Turner, one of the most influential historians of his time, was actively minimizing enslavement's importance. In 1893, Turner wrote, "When American history comes to be rightly viewed, it will be seen that the enslavement question is an incident in the period from the end of the first half of the present century to the close of the Civil War." Turner told Americans, "Don't focus on the enslavement, look west. The frontier, not the plantation, was what made America exceptional." But perhaps no academic did more damage than Woodrow Wilson. Before becoming president, Wilson was a historian who legitimized the lost cause through his scholarly work. He believed the white knights had saved the South from what he called black domination. Think about that for a second. A future president of the United States writing that an evil organization saved America. When Wilson won the presidency in 1913, he brought these views into the White House, resegregating the federal government and purging black employees from positions they had held for decades. But Wilson's most damaging contribution to the lost cause was yet to come, and it would change American culture forever. In 1915, a friend of President Wilson named Thomas Dixon wrote a novel which was adapted into a film by D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation. It was America's first true blockbuster, a technical marvel that revolutionized filmmaking. It was also one of the most evil and discriminatory films ever made. The film portrayed the white knights as heroes who saved white Southern women from savage black men who were played by white actors in blackface. Its climactic scene showed triumphant white knights riding to restore civilization to the South. And where was this piece of Confederate propaganda first screened? The place where it can do maximum damage, the White House. The film was a sensation seen by millions of Americans, and as a direct result, the White Knights, which had been largely inactive since the 1870s, experienced a massive revival. Some of its strongest chapters weren't even in the South, but in places like Indiana. A single film inspired millions of Americans to join a radical and evil organization. That's the power of propaganda when it has the government's seal of approval. Hollywood was just getting started. In 1939, Gone with the Wind hit theaters, another blockbuster that romanticized the antebellum South and portrayed enslavement as a benign institution where happy enslaved people were loyal to their kind masters. The film portrayed Reconstruction as a time when the South was ravaged, ignoring the civil rights progress and democratic reforms of the era. Then in 1946, Disney released Song of the South, a song that describes the wonderful relationship between master and enslaved. Even in the Western genre, perhaps America's most iconic film tradition served to minimize enslavement by focusing on the frontier instead of the plantation, exactly as Frederick Jackson Turner had advocated. In The Searchers, widely considered one of the greatest Westerns ever made, John Wayne's character proudly declares, "A man's only good for one oath at a time. I took mine to the Confederate States of America." Just like that, Confederate soldiers weren't traitors. They were honorable men who simply had competing loyalties. These films are still being watched and celebrated today. And that leads to an uncomfortable question. What other propaganda might we still be consuming without realizing it? Because by the early 20th century, the lost cause needed to evolve to continue spreading. As Confederate soldiers aged and died, their children formed offshoots like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In 1893, the Confederate Veteran magazine began publication, eventually reaching hundreds of thousands of readers until it ceased publication in 1932. This magazine became the official mouthpiece of the Lost Cause movement. What emerged from these efforts was a sanitized version of the lost cause that emphasized heritage rather than hatred. According to this new narrative, Confederate symbols were simply part of Southern identity, a way to honor ancestors who fought for what they believed in. This transformation was remarkably effective. What started with Mississippi's state flag in 1894, a clear symbol of Jim Crow, eventually became just part of Southern culture. By the 1970s, you had the Dukes of Hazzard on primetime television with a car named General Lee, sporting the Confederate flag while playing Dixie on its horn. And millions of Americans didn't bat an eye because by then, it had been successfully rebranded as heritage, not hate. This watered-down mythology allowed Confederate symbols to spread far beyond the South. By the mid-20th century, the Confederate flag appeared everywhere from college dorm rooms to rock concerts. And by the 1930s, the lost cause became officially American history. Generations of Americans learned that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and the Reconstruction was a terrible mistake driven by vengeful Northerners. Meanwhile, they learned almost nothing about the 200,000 black soldiers who fought for the Union. black politicians elected during the Reconstruction, and the systematic campaign of terror that overthrew Reconstruction governments. But the most disturbing part in all of this is that the lost cause didn't fade out in the 1930s. It's still with us today. Look around you. That Confederate monument in your town square, the textbooks being debated in school board meetings today, and the political fights over how American history is being taught in schools. They are the front lines in a 150-year propaganda campaign that is still shaping America today. And what makes it truly dangerous is that most Americans don't even realize they have been influenced by it. In 2015, a high school student in Texas noticed something strange in her textbook. The section on enslavement described enslaved Africans as workers who came to America seeking jobs. There was no mention of kidnapping, chains, or human ownership. When she posted a photo of the textbook page online, it went viral. The publisher, McGraw-Hill, one of the largest educational publishers in the world, eventually apologized and promised to fix the language in future editions. As recently as 2010, the Texas Board of Education, which influences textbook content nationwide, approved standards that minimized enslavement's role in causing the Civil War and required teaching the positive aspects of American enslavement. A 2018 survey by the Southern Poverty Law Center found that only 8% of high school seniors could identify enslavement as the central cause of the Civil War. 2/3 didn't know that it took a constitutional amendment to end enslavement. When students don't understand, they can't understand the racial inequalities that persist today. That's not education, sadly. That is indoctrination. So, what does it say about America that we have more monuments to traitors who fought to preserve enslavement than to the enslaved people themselves? In 2019, the New York Times launched the 1619 Project, an initiative aimed at reframing American history by placing the consequences of enslavement and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of the national narrative. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Politicians condemned it as propaganda and introduced bills to ban it from schools. Some historians criticized specific claims, while others defended the project's core premise. The same pattern emerges in debates over critical race theory, which is a legal framework that examines how racism is embedded in institutions and systems rather than just individual prejudice. Despite being primarily taught in law schools and not K-12 classrooms, critical race theory has become a catch-all boogeyman for any discussion of systemic discrimination in American history. We are still fighting that same battle that began in 1866 between those who wants to confront America's history of racial injustice honestly and those who prefer comfortable myths the lost cause taught. That brings us to the end of yet another enlightening video segment. Don't forget to support our works by hitting the thumb button. Share video with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in to our channel for every update if you are yet to. It's a delight being with you on this journey of awareness and truth. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.